Welcome to Champion Review, where I analyze the ins and outs of champions in the game and tell you if Riot kicked it out of the park or royally fucked up. Today, I'm going to be looking at one of my favorite mages, Syndra, the Dark Sovereign. In this video, we'll be covering my 4-point rating system of gameplay, aesthetic, lore, and theme, rating them from 1 to 5, with 1 being the worst and 5 being the best. We'll also cover Syndra's role, her pros and cons, and then hand down a verdict at the end. Starting off with gameplay, this aspect represents how fun and interesting she is to play and added points for a unique kit with a lot of depth. Let's go over her kit. Syndra's passive is Transcendent. Each of Syndra's abilities gains an extra effect at max rank, meaning that Syndra has a far more interesting power curve than most other champions. In addition to spiking when she levels her ult, she also spikes at levels 9 and 13 when she maxes out one of her damaging abilities. Level 9 is the most impactful because that's when her Q will be at max rank. Her Q is Dark Sphere. It's low cooldown, spammable, AoE magic damage. When maxed, Shadow Ball deals 25% extra damage to champions, and you always want to max this first. Great for wave clear. But the coolest part is this. That's smooth. It just feels good to cast the spell. The black globules remain on the ground for 6 seconds after casting, which will become very relevant soon. Syndra's W is Force of Will. She picks up a thing. What thing? It don't matter, baby. She'll pick up balls, she'll pick up minions, she'll pick up blue buffs, she'll pick up well, no, she won't pick up Baron, but that'd be sick, am I right? And she chucks them, slowing enemies for 25 to 45%. When maxed, this will deal 20% bonus true damage. You can also cast it while moving, just like your Q. Kiss. The last notable thing is that picking up a Dark Sphere resets its remaining uptime, which is useful for setting up Syndra's ultimate, which we'll get to soon. Syndra's E is Scatter the Weak. This is her utility spell, and her best CC. It lets you knock away melees and would-be assassins, keeping her safe in lane. Additionally, you can stun enemies by sniping them with your Dark Spheres. Something interesting to note, you can prep multiple Dark Spheres before they disappear and launch them all at once if you've got the right angle. You can also quickly cast your Q and E to stun before the Dark Sphere is fully formed if you time it correctly. Her ultimate is Unleashed Power. Syndra sends all of her Dark Spheres at the enemy, including the 3 orbiting her. This ability picks up the Dark Spheres you've cast that remain on the ground, so you're encouraged to cast it as a finisher after using your Q as many times as possible. Dark Spheres remain on the ground for 6 seconds after casting, and the cooldown of your Q is 4 seconds, which can be reduced to 2.4 seconds at 40% CDR. With the addition of resetting the oldest sphere with your W, the maximum number of spheres you can create is 4! Which more than doubles the damage of your ultimate, so it's very important. Once you've ulted someone, all the orbs will land near the opponent and become usable with your W and your E especially. Imagine this scenario. You're in a team fight, you poke out the enemy with your Qs and Ws, prepping your ult with 4 Dark Spheres, then absolutely demolish any squishy enemy that dares to blink in your direction with 1330 base damage and 140% AP ratio. 7 orbs land at their feet. You E said orbs, creating an avalanche of black orbs which stuns multiple enemies at once, perhaps even the entire enemy team, setting up the rest of your teammates to clean up. That is Syndra's potential. Syndra is a mid-lane burst mage who pushes off waves with ease, deletes squishies, and dishes out high AoE damage and CC from a relatively safe distance. Notably, she has one of the highest base mana pools in the early game, and an above average mana pool in the late game. I'd say from a team comp perspective, her most important roles are pushing waves quickly, zoning dangerous opponents during team fights, magical DPS, and of course, assassinating squishies. Though naturally, like most glass cannons, she's vulnerable to getting bursted down herself. Her E is her only defensive option. And if it's on cooldown when that game's scary fool shows up, then Godspeed. Also, she's particularly sad to fall behind on since most of her usefulness rests in her damage. My overall thoughts on Syndra is that she's a very well-designed champion. Her kit feels very intuitive and natural to use, at least that's my impression. Her abilities flow into one another wonderfully, with Q being the all-important focal point. She's very simple on paper, but all the little quirks her abilities have, like Q and W being able to be cast while moving, manipulation of her Dark Spheres and their timers give her a unique identity and place in the roster. I gave it some thought, and after deliberating, I feel obligated to give Syndra's gameplay a 5 out of 5. That's not to say her gameplay is necessarily my favorite out of all the champions, but rather that Riot's vision for her was perfectly realized, and is very difficult to improve without breaking down the core of what she is. According to champion.gg, she's fairly popular at 4% play rate and a 50% win rate, suggesting that they aren't playing her because she's overpowered. Math checks out. Moving on to aesthetic. In this category, we'll be covering Syndra's splash art, animations, and voice lines. Bonus points if their theme music or related content is good. At first, I thought Syndra's design was somewhat silly. Her outfit is really frisky, showing all that skin and the cleavage and the thighs and the belts around her waist. Oh sure guys, those belts are just keeping her outfit together, whatever you say. And the crown on her head is so big, it almost looks like a mask. Her hair appears to be long and white, but you'd be forgiven for forgetting it even exists, since her crown and outfit and orbs control all of her color real estate, and her flowing white hair almost blends into the background. Which is a shame, because I can imagine her being very beautiful under that crown. Though maybe that is a personal gripe. I somewhat warmed up to her design once I read more of her lore, but as a first impression I didn't intuitively understand her, and I think that's a fault of the design. Similarly, the buildings in the background seem like generic Ionian temples, but her lore seems to imply a more specific possibility. The one temple on the left seems broken down, leaning on its side with water dripping over the rooftops. Where is the water coming from? I don't actually have the answer. Her model is, unfortunately, outdated, at least in pixel count. It doesn't look great up close. Her animations are fine, I guess. The quality is fine, but Riot's standards nowadays are clearly higher. One positive note, however, is that the visual effects of her abilities are very pretty. Her Q and W both have a nice wind-up before detonating with color. Also, her ult animation of the dark spheres in motion is lovely. But there's something else that I seriously can't believe I've never noticed before. Syndra's abilities change color when you max them. Her Q, W, and E all turn from a dark purple into a dark reddish hue. Her ult doesn't actually change in color, sadly. As for voice lines, Syndra, like most older champions, has a slightly limited selection, with enough variety and cool quotes to keep you entertained, but not enough to teach you anything new about the character. I do think her voice is cool though. I'll keep this one short and just play some of my favorite quotes.
People fear what they cannot understand. More. I can be so much more. My potential is limitless. I will not be restrained. So much untapped power!
Syndra's aesthetic is good, but it has some glaring flaws which prevent it from reaching the stars. To be blunt, I'm not the biggest fan of her design purely from an enjoyment of the art standpoint. Her animations could use improvement, and her base model also needs some texture work before I can rate Syndra's aesthetic any higher than 3 out of 5. Let's dive into Syndra's lore and hopefully answer some of the questions brought up by her splash art. Syndra grew up in a small Ionian village. As a child, she endured teasing from her brother and was blamed by her parents for silly things like spoiled milk and other misfortunes that fell upon their family, as if she were cursed. She bottled up her emotions until one day her brother's bullying caused her to erupt with rage and magical power that she could not control. Her parents sent her away to a remote cliffside temple in the hopes that she could eventually learn to control her powers. There, under the tutelage of a hermit priest named Koenigan, Syndra devoted herself to learning how to temper her emotions. However, Syndra grew frustrated, as instead of gaining more control, over the years her magic seemed to weaken. She confronted her master, forcing him to confess. In truth, Koenigan had actually been suppressing Syndra's true powers. For her own safety, he said. Fueled by betrayal and rage, Syndra awakened fully to her powers. She killed her master and destroyed the cliffside temple, but before she could do any more than that, the literal spirit of Ionia pulled her beneath the ground and into the dreaming pool to imprison her. After a long time, she woke up and went back to being angry at everyone. Cyric crawled from the gloom, breathing in fresh air, and stared about her, eyes wide in shock. Easily half of the fortress was gone. Her gaze drifted up. At first, she saw nothing but darkness where there should have been stars. With a sharp intake of air, she realized she was looking at the silhouette of the greatest towers and ramparts hanging against the night sky. It hadn't collapsed into the sea at all. It had been ripped from the island and lifted towards the heavens. She stared, her mouth gaping. She had known Syndra was powerful, but this power she could never have imagined. As Cyric watched, frozen by the sight, she saw one of the Noxian warships moored in the harbor below, lifted from the sea. Men tumbled from its decks like so many ants, falling to their deaths on the rocks below as the ship was lifted ever higher. Then it fell, smashing back down upon 2 other vessels, crushing them to splinters. The destruction was catastrophic. The ruined castle in the sky began to drift northwards. Alone at the sundered peak of the Dael Ahira, Cyric watched it go, until the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. So, at the end of Syndra's story, she's keeping an entire fortress hanging in the sky with just her own magic. So, maybe those buildings in the background of her art are part of the island she ripped off that she lives in? It's hard to tell. I can't seem to find any confirming evidence, and the backdrop of her splash is too foggy to analyze. And where is this water coming from? I think the lore is pretty cool, but maybe a little simple for my taste. The writing was good, so if you're interested, you should read the Dreaming Pool short story. Overall, Syndra's lore gets a 3 out of 5 from me. To find out if Syndra's theme is good or not, we need to first ask whether all parts of her, gameplay, aesthetic, and lore, fit together under a unifying idea, a theme. Syndra's core themes are power and freedom. For me, her most important quote is, "I will not be restrained." Repression leads to resentment, and ultimately anger. Syndra was never allowed to be her true self, so she took back control of her life by force. Her abilities reflect her core themes of power and freedom very well. Power is obvious, she deals tons of damage, enough said. And freedom is represented by the smooth casting of her Q and W. She wears a giant crown and spiked shoulder plates in her splash art and lives in a giant floating fortress. If that doesn't signal power, I don't know what does. The frisky way of dressing may also represent her desire to be free, as she's not repressing her own sexuality, or something deep like that. But do the belts imply that she's still restrained? Confused. Also, her crown, which represents power, is hiding most of her face, so maybe the real theme is that her power is actually the thing holding her back, because as long as she has it, she's unable to live a normal life. Or maybe the artist just wanted to draw a hot babe with thighs and cleavage and belts. I don't know. Who knows? One more thing to note is the visual effects of the abilities turning red at max rank. Red is the color of anger and passion, generally speaking. Perhaps that alludes to the fact that her true powers are only unleashed after she's overcome with rage after learning of her master's betrayal. This is backed up by the fact that Q max increases damage to champions, which could be interpreted as the rage she feels towards everyone who imprisoned her. In any case, Syndra's theme is perfectly realized in her gameplay, lore, and aesthetic, complementing each other very well with little room for improvement. I happily give Syndra's theme a 5 out of 5. Syndra is a wonderful champion to play, and if you've been thinking about maining her, even just for an off-roll, I think she's a brilliant choice, and I would definitely recommend you at least try her out. I give Syndra overall a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching this video. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and let me know in the comments what champions you want me to review next. I mostly do weekly League of Legends and Legends of Runeterra gameplay videos in addition to playing fighting games on Fridays, but I plan to make champion reviews for all of Riot's future champions and reworks, in addition to retro reviews like this one every now and then. And if that interests you, please subscribe, and make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload. But until next time, good night, you sweet bloody bastards. Good night.